the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord, grant us concentration that we may learn, listen, understand, and have a peaceful mind, and remember that you're with us always. Amen. So for this next video, we're going to continue our discussion of population ecology, looking again a little closer at the logistic graph, and then taking some time to better look at some of the changes related to that. And so as a quick review, when we talk about growth curves, we have two different types. Exponential growth, in which we simply have reproductive rate multiplied by the population size, capital N. And this will show a dramatic increase. So if we were to plot out an exponential growth, we would see it start low and then dramatically increase exponentially over time. This is not going to represent most natural populations simply because there will be some limit into the number of individuals that can live in a given geographic area. And so for that curve, we were talking about logistic growth curves, where we start as exponential, okay? And then as it gets closer to the carrying capacity, the maximum number of individuals, it will level off. So this level point here, okay, is the carrying capacity, which we're going to abbreviate as K. And so to calculate this, or to determine how the rate is changing as it gets closer to the carrying capacity, we use this adjustment factor. Okay, and as I mentioned in the last video, this is simply a measurement of how close to the carrying capacity the population is, and will represent sort of the percentage of reproductive rate that's going to be present there. So it's going to be carrying capacity minus the number in the population divided by carrying capacity. The closer the population is to the carrying capacity, the lower this number is, which means the population growth is slowing and slowing more. At carrying capacity, theoretically, this will be 0, which means there's no increase or decrease in the population size. In other words, we could say the reproductive rate has reduced to the effect that the number of births and the number of deaths are relatively equal. Also considering, immigration and emigration, immigration, number of individuals moving into the population, emigration, the number moving out of the population. And so we can look at this and we can consider this as to what the curve looks like. And on the previous slide here, we gave you an example of that. In this case, the carrying capacity for the population is 1,000. And so as the population grew and got closer to the carrying capacity, the growth rate was reduced, again, using our correction factor to calculate that. And we looked at these graphs too, and we noted that sometimes the population will exceed carrying capacity, and we'll see a negative growth rate, sort of an adjustment back to the carrying capacity. So it's not always exactly going to be 0, is the point. The other point that I wanted to start with today is talking about how carrying capacity can change over time. And so for this particular graph, we're looking at the number of pelts, the number of individuals, either snowshoe hares, shown by the blue graph, or blue line on the graph, or the number of lynx, shown by the red line on the graph. And so as you can see, as we move through the years, this goes from 1845 to 1935, there's a dependent relationship that's present here. The carrying capacity, or the number of lynx that can be supported in a given area, is going to be connected to the number of prey that's present in that area. So as we see, as the number of hares increase, there's going to be an increase in the number of lynx. Now, it's not always constant, but this is representative of an increase in the carrying capacity. As there's more of the resource, in the case of the lynx, there's more food available, that means they're going to have a higher reproductive rate, more live births, more individuals that survive, hence the carrying capacity increases. And so this shows you a good example of how the change over time, or the population of the carrying capacity, size of the carrying capacity, is going to be influenced by other species that are present or other environmental conditions that may be in there. And so we could look at this as a codependent relationship. We'll talk about this a little bit later when we're talking about prey versus predator relationships. So that gives you an example showing how the population has changed over time. In this graph or this slide, we're looking at the human population, okay? And so human population growth, there's going to be, we've seen for a long period of time, it looks like the human population was at or near the carrying capacity, which in this case we would say probably estimate here 20 to 50 million people that were present there. But then starting here, you see first of all a big reduction here, and that would be where the Black Death, so 14th century, when that hit, a large number of individuals had died and lost the ability to, well, lost the number of individuals that were reproduced there. However, the curve quickly increased. And we see two changes that have significantly improved that. The first change was the Industrial Revolution. Okay? Improved technology meant that we had better food production, better distribution of the food, people able to interact with each other and support each other better. The second was public health, or to be more specific on that, healthcare has improved. We understand better diseases and how to cure them, which allows this to then dramatically increase, or as we could say, re-enter the exponential phase of growth. I always say there's a couple of interesting blips on here. The first one is right there. And you'll notice there's sort of a little peak where it seems to level off. In that period, we're looking at probably about 100 years ago. And many of you are aware, as we're dealing with the COVID-19 now, in 1918, there was an outbreak of Spanish flu. And the Spanish flu resulted in a large number of deaths, as significant as the number of individuals coming out of a world war where we've had deaths in that way too. But the real impact of the Spanish flu was the fact that it impacted, or it caused the death of people in the reproductive age. So, you know, it wasn't necessarily the old and the young that were dying, but those that were in the age of having families. And so as a result of that, we see that little blip in there. Now, there's some that believe we're kind of reaching carrying capacity again. Around 7 billion is where we are right now. And so we're reaching that carrying capacity where we'll see a change. You know, part of this is social change also, where we see differences in family size and the population will be affected by that. So overall, we see that the carrying capacity for humans, if we would say on Earth, has dramatically increased over the last 300 years as a result of technological improvement, the Industrial Revolution, and changes in the food. One that I always think to mention is housing and protection. Think about 200 years ago, okay? 200 years ago, the population size in areas where the weather was very harsh, desert areas, Arctic areas, was always remained low because of their ability to have proper housing. As we've improved the housing conditions and the ability to provide for people in those types of conditions, we can see that there was a dramatic increase as a result of that. Okay. Now, where is the populations headed? Well, One of the ways that we can study human population, looking at demographic studies here, is to begin to look at what stage of life people or individuals are in. And so if we say 20 years, 15 to 20 years, before that are the young, so that would be pre-reproductive, okay? From 15 up to maybe 50 or 55, these are the reproductive age. And we have over 65, this is the post-reproductive individuals, okay? And so if we were looking at a natural population, we would break it down in this means. And we would say populations that have a large number of pre-reproductive individuals, or a larger number of pre-reproductive individuals, would be populations we would expect to see an increase over the next 20 years or so. Whereas populations that have a larger number of post-reproductive age people are going to show decreases in the population size. There's not as many individuals that are producing offspring. And so if we compare Europe and Africa, here we have Sweden and Kenya, you can see Sweden, although not completely perfect, is almost rectangular shaped, okay? And so that means there's an equal distribution of individuals at all three stages. This would be representative of a stable population, a population that's not expected to increase dramatically over the next 20 years or so. Whereas Kenya, African country, we see this triangle shape. That tells us that there's a larger number of individuals in the reproductive age, which means as they move forward, there's going to be more in the reproductive age in the next 20 years, which means more individuals born, population theoretically will increase. And so on the top of the slide here, we see an analysis of that, where we have the population size in millions comparing 2005 and 2050. And you can see that in Europe, they actually estimate a decrease in population. Fewer individuals are having babies, having offspring, which means the population is stable, maybe slightly decreased. Whereas in the African population, we can see a dramatic increase that potentially could occur. Again, more in the pre-reproductive ages. So when we talk about natural populations, we can use an analysis of, or these, we would call these pyramid type graphs, to begin to look at how the population is going to grow and what's going to happen in the population over the next 20 to 50 years, okay? Depending on generation size. Again, if it's a very short generation time, then it would be a much shorter time period that we would be considering. For human health, we consider about 20 years to be reproductive or generation time, and so therefore we can see the growth over this period of time. This brings up another consideration when we talk about population growth, and that's survivorship. Well, what do we mean by survivorship? We could describe survivorship as being the number or percentage of individuals from a population or from a generation that is alive at different points throughout their life cycle. Okay? And so on this graph, we're showing proportion surviving. Okay? In other words, the inverse of how many died, inverse of mortality, but how many survive at different points in their life cycle. So we go from 0 to 100 as in percent of lifestyle. If we're talking about humans, we would probably be talking about 75, 80, maybe with healthcare we could even stretch into 90 now as being the full potential lifespan. And so we can break this down into 3 types of curves, and based on the type of curve, we can describe how this species is taking care of its young and how it's surviving. Okay? So type 1 curve is human health. And basically what we see for the human or type 1 is that there's a high percentage surviving early in life with a dramatic decrease as it approaches the full lifespan. And so for these are individuals or species that take care of their young. They typically produce small numbers each birthing cycle. I mean, humans, single birth, maybe twins or triplets, but beyond that, it's not very common. These individuals do have smaller offspring. Think of herd animals. Okay, again, same idea. There's a lot of care taken with the young to make sure they survive to reproductive age in themselves. The second type of curve, here represented by a hydra, there is an even probability of the hydra dying or surviving at any point during the life cycle. Simply put, think of a hydra. Okay, these are small invertebrates that are going to be prey for a lot of other animals, food that they're going to provide for that. When they're born, actually most hydra are going to be cloned, so they're not going to necessarily produce offspring. But they have an equal chance, even the adults, it's very likely that they're going to be eaten as well as the young. So any point during the life cycle, there's an equal probability of dying. The third type of curve is represented by the oyster, okay? And the third type of curve, or type 3 survivorship curve, shows a high mortality or low survivorship early in life, but once established, there's a high longevity. So think of oysters. Oysters are species that when they reproduce, they basically release the gametes, the fertilization occurs, and the animals or the offspring are basically left on their own to survive. A large number are eaten early in life. But once the oyster establishes its shell, it's able to survive a very long time. Individuals that fall into the type 3 curve generally will produce a large number of offspring, each spawning each reproductive cycle, but will take little care to protect them. In other words, they're going to put the bank on saying, I'm producing a lot of offspring in the hope that a few will survive. So how can we use this? Well, I like to use a simple example to demonstrate that. Okay? And so you go to Lowe's or to the Walmart, and you decide you're going to buy a plant for your dorm room. And this plant that you buy, you want to make sure it's going to survive a long time, okay? As long as you water it and put it in the window so it has sun. And so you find this beautiful plant, okay? Beauty's in the eye of the beholder, keep in mind. But you find this beautiful plant, you say, I want to keep that in my dorm room. Now you got to decide, do I want to buy a very young plant or do I want to buy an older plant to look at the survivability? And so in this case, I would suggest this is mostly type 1 curve, okay? Slightly higher survivability early in its lifespan. So it would make sense then to buy this plant when it's young because there's a higher probability of it dying as it gets older. Okay. So that gives you an example, a simple example of how we're going to use these data. So a question still always remains at this point as we think about that. It probably makes sense to you that there would be these different types of curves based on the care of the animal. But it would also make sense that if we produced as many offspring as possible, even if we're taking care of them, that there would be the highest probability of increasing the population size. So why is it that animals don't simply produce as many offspring as possible? Well, an example is shown here in birds, in which we are considering, in this case, the number of offspring produced each year, okay, against the adult mortality rate. In other words, how fit are the animals, okay? And so as you look, the number of offspring produced each year, as that increases, there's an increase in the mortality rate, which means a lower fitness. Well, why is that? Well, when we talk about this, we can talk about a couple different ways. First of all, animals that take care of their young like birds, it takes energy in the case of the parents to take care of the offspring. The more offspring there are, the more feeding that's involved, and therefore the less fit or the more likely that a parent will die, which again may impact the survivability of the offspring themselves. The second consideration that's shown here is size of the birds and the number of clutch. And you'll notice as we increase the number of eggs laid for each nesting, the size of the birds decreases. If the size of the bird decreases, that likely indicates there's going to be a reduction in the fitness of that individual. And so therefore, long term, the populations may be impacted by that. So this is the price of reproduction. Okay? The more effort put into raising the young, the more or the less likely the individual will survive long term. So that's our discussion of population ecology. In the next video, we'll begin to look at community ecology, the interaction between species and how that affects their growth. Thank you again for watching this video. If you have questions, as always, please post them on the Schoology discussion board or email me and I will get you answers. Thank you.